I'm Dawn Milne from Ivy's Department of Public Affairs, and I'm pleased to be here with Ivy Professor Rob Klassen to discuss his research on supply chains and environmental and social performance. Rob, why is it so important for companies today to improve their environmental and social performance within their supply chains?
Well, I think we can sort of look at it from several different perspectives. The first one really being around how do companies think about managing risk. And given recent events, whether it's in terms of environmental issues, where there are spills or other sorts of disasters like that, or whether it's more subtle in terms of managing customer reactions to products or product safety issues, often all of these sort of play out in the marketplace, potentially harming a company's long-term economic viability. The other side that they really have to think about, though, is whether there may in fact be market opportunities for them to pursue. In a growing number of examples one can think of where companies have responded to opportunities to improve and perform better within the marketplace.
What measures can companies take to improve such performance?
Well, I think in terms of certainly managing risk, it's really understanding what's going on in the supply chain, trying to think a little bit more clearly and measure what your suppliers are doing. And most companies right now, I think, either hopefully trust their suppliers are doing the right thing, may ask them a simple survey that isn't necessarily backed up with any sort of firm auditing, or alternatively say, we just won't ask those questions because we're not sure we like the answers that may come out of that. And so I think the first step is really to understand what is going on in your supply chain, usually backwards towards suppliers. Occasionally it's about customers too, though, where customers may in fact not be using your product correctly, or alternatively might be unaware of some of the hazards associated with product use. And normally we include that as part of the safety social issues too. The second part, though, is often companies, if they're sophisticated enough and pushing hard enough to look backwards in the supply chain one link, sort of stop there and say, well, now again, we're trusting our suppliers to go further back. And I think there's a huge amount of hidden risk with that. Whether it's in the case of the lead in toys that we heard about a few years back, where it wasn't the immediate supplier, it was the second-tier supplier, at least, that was contributing to the problem. That ultimately creates enormous implications for companies in their supply chain. And it's not just big name brand companies. Smaller companies as well often get tied up where there's a disruption in the supply chain because in fact they're unable to have the same supplier that they've had in the past.
And can companies that implement such measures still be competitive and prosperous?
I think it depends a lot on how their stakeholders respond. We've looked at, in the context of my research, thinking about responsibility as really kind of characterizing two parts. There's the part about how much control do you have over your supply chain partners, and so large multinationals clearly, in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases exercise a fair bit of control over their suppliers. And so they're able to, first of all, dictate terms, second of all, more actively monitor, and so one could argue they have a fair bit of control. The other aspect, though, that I think gets less attention by managers is what areas are you being held accountable for? And accountable is somewhat different in the sense that when you're talking about accountability, it's about trying to sort of see whether outside parties, it could be customers, it could be NGOs, it could be the government, is requiring you to report on performance, requiring you to sort of justify what you're doing in the supply chain. And so many companies say, well, I don't have control because it's a large, diversified supply base. I might be buying a commodity that I don't necessarily see any direct connection to. So for example, soya from rainforest represents a very small amount of soya that actually goes into the food supply chain. And so companies turn around and say, well, I don't have control over that, therefore I'm not going to pay much attention to it. When in fact NGOs, customers, and government regulators increasingly are paying attention to that. And so you're being held accountable even though you don't have a lot of control over those issues, and you have to try to manage that side as well. And so ultimately the way you work with stakeholders can influence your economic performance as well.
Thank you, Rob.